Awesome. Well, we are wrapping up today. Today is going to be information overload day. And maybe some of you are like, how has the first two sessions not been that? Today's going to be just all of the practical details that we could possibly think of pertaining to groups. How many people are in groups? What do groups look like? When do they meet? As much as we can talk about and as much as we can answer on our end on that front, we want to do so. And before we get to that, I know last week we ended our time together by saying, hey, your homework is going to be to take 5-10 minutes and just think about maybe some concerns, maybe some insecurities, maybe some fears that you might have about leading groups. That tends to be something that can be pretty common, is experiencing some things that we might have some hesitancy over. Maybe it's as simple or as practical as like a space. The space might not be conducive or you're concerned about that, or perhaps it's a little bit more personal or emotional or intimate, and maybe there's some fear that's internal of like, oh man, I'm not sure that I'm ready to step out in leadership in this way, or how do I handle these types of situations. So I'd love just to create some space where we can discuss those things, where we can bring those to the light. That's been something that's been on my heart, is how often keeping things in the darkness starts to fester, and they start to grow and grow and grow when bringing them to the light is such a huge, huge gift of grace that God has given us, that we can bring those things up, we can talk, we can pray, and we can give them to the Lord. So, does anyone have something that they want to share starting off pertaining to potential insecurity surrounding leading groups and what all that may look like? Yeah,
I guess.
absolutely.
I'm not very good at confrontation. So how do you confront somebody who continues to derail the group?
Yeah.
Or take over conversation, or like always has something to say that
For
might
sure.
not always be on topic?
Yep.
How do you confront that?
Yeah.
Or fix it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And if you've had any group experience, I'm sure that we all can think of times and places where that's come up. We're going to dive in depth on that topic, and I would just say that a few things that we'll go more in depth on. Some general rules that we always encourage people with would be to praise in public and to correct in private. So in a situation like that, I think the first thing that we want to do is set up some sort of conversation where we can engage with them one-on-one. So whether that's right after group, whether that's we schedule a lunch or coffee with them, we go out and we have a conversation with them. And then the second thing is I would go back and hit on some of the content we discussed last time about conflict management. Practice reframing, right? Like this conversation, one way of looking at it is it's gonna suck. It's gonna be brutal. This is gonna be really challenging. But the other way is this conversation is going to provide some solutions and remedies to what we're facing. So we're entering in a different space, and then lead with kindness or value. So affirming their voice, but also being pretty direct with them. So something as simple as like, I'm so appreciative of the way that you share. I think your voice allows other people in the group to feel free to share. And I'd love to talk and work with you about what it would look like to create more space for other people's voices to be heard. And so I think just a simple, I don't want to say simple as if it's like easy, because I understand that that's not easy. But I think with some not massive adjustments, a conversation that can be sometimes crippling can all of a sudden feel pretty accessible. Because instead of viewing it as we're going to fix this problem, we're going to work together to create a better environment for our group. So those would be a few things, and that type of conflict or conversation specifically, we're going to maybe go a little bit deeper on towards the end of our time. But those would be the three things that I would encourage. Correct in private, right? So in a conversation where there's something like that going on, one-on-one, following up with reframing the way we view it, and then leading with some value or kindness. But those sorts of conversations are almost going to be like a given, right? When we create these sorts of environments. So I'm appreciative of you thinking through them proactively of like, I know this one's coming, so how do I prepare for it well? That's very thoughtful. Thanks for sharing that, Scott. Anything else?
If I can expand on
Yeah.
that a little bit, I think often you're going to find that there's a conflict. Some people just aren't comfortable with silence, and so they think they're helping you out
Sure.
by jumping in
Yeah.
and trying to initiate. So it's kind of an education situation.
Hmm.
And then a lot of people don't realize that they talk that much. And and so they're not offended when you point out that give other people a chance,
Yeah.
so to speak. And so don't always think it's going to be
Sure.
a negative experience.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're just educating them on how to be in a group.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that, Benji. It's helpful. Thank you. Anything else?
I think a lot of people fear failure.
Yeah.
And they fear it, but they don't even know what it looks like,
Yeah.
especially in a group situation. But they fear that they're not going to get the group to where they think the group should be going.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big obstacle for a lot of people
Yeah.
to get into these situations.
For sure. For sure. Yep. Yep. Well, as we schedule some time at the end of this gathering here today to meet up one-on-one, if there is something that comes up between now and then, I'd love just to dialogue through that. I want to make sure that we're creating space for you to feel like you're resourced and equipped and not just told, hey, do these things, but really also spoken into in a way that edifies you and that might build you up. And I think Benji's, some of what you're saying is so spot on of this kind of fear of failure, letting someone down, and how common that is to have and possess, and yet we feel like we're the only one carrying it, and it becomes a huge burden, and we're nervous. And so just having some conversation, I think, can be an incredible way to begin to move away from carrying all that weight ourselves. Okay, so as we schedule some time together, as we end our time together today for the coming week or so, if something does come up between now and then, let's continue to talk. This is not like, oh, sorry, you missed your one chance, and you're not going to get to talk about it again. But let's start with some recap as we did last time. So last week we started to pivot and talk about the how of leading groups. Last week we talked about the three topics of prayer, fellowship, and study, and the significance and importance of these, and how they work together to accomplish what we're trying to do, which is create community and a sense of belonging. We talked about prayer being a personal conversation with the Lord, and how in prayer it both connects us deeper to God as well as deeper to one another when we engage with that. Fellowship, this notion of one anothering, right? That was the language we used, that in order to truly embody fellowship, it requires us to know one another more than just kind of a favorite sports team, know where you work type of sentiment, right? We use that analogy of if you have a broken wrist, but you go to the hospital and you're treated for a sprained ankle, you're receiving care, but the care you're receiving is not the care you're needing. And so in order to really engage and elicit a degree of care, we have to know to a degree what's going on in someone's life. So there needs to be some level of depth of knowledge there. And then lastly, we talked about study. And we used this quote from Jen Wilkin with two eyes, right? That said, the heart cannot love what the mind does not know. And we talked about how significant it is for us as disciples of Jesus that we're called to love God, and we need to know who God is. If we're called to love him, we should know who he is, and we should know why he's deserving of our love, and how we go about loving. And then we ended our time with the EQ exercise, those three circles, that Venn diagram, where we talked about some helpful qualities of some leaders in our life and some unhelpful qualities of leaders in our life. And we saw that overwhelmingly what all of us value most is not how intelligent someone is not maybe how competent they are in their field of work, but what we value most is how they make us feel. Did they listen to us well? Did they belittle us? How did they invest in our life? And that was something that we ended our time with. Jen shared some EQ tools, eye contact, listening, body tone, body posture, those sorts of things. How do we create a space that really helps people feel like it's safe to engage in some of the deeper things to share and engage with? Today we're going to close our time, like I said, by really looking at some practical, nitty-gritty, like granular details. So my hope by the end of this would be that all of your questions in terms of what does this look like, or how do you go about doing this, or what do groups look like at this church in this way, all of those types of questions would be answered. It's not to say that you shouldn't have questions by the end, but that's kind of the aim of today, is answering those questions. And as we go through today, please feel free to ask some questions. If we're talking about a specific area of content and you're like, hey, well, what about this? Or have you thought about this? Or what do you guys do when you handle these sorts of situations? Please feel free to ask those questions. Today is kind of the like I said, the granular detail. We're going to be talking a little bit less about some philosophy type of conversations, of thinking through it through that lens, and more just really, really practical conversations. So let's dive into that. We're going to do our best to answer, like, what does a normal group look like? What does a normal group look like? Well, the time of the day is going to be the first place we're going to start. For most of our groups, they meet during a weekday evening, and that's usually what it looks like. There is some groups that that meet during the morning, and that is an option. But most of our groups meet during the weekday evening time. A lot of our groups tend to fall on Wednesdays. I think that's a day that works well for people's schedule. Monday, I think, as well. My experience has been the closer we get to the weekend, the harder it is to get people to commit to giving up some of that time. So Thursday and Friday are a lot more challenging, I think, than Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So just something to keep in mind, but you as the leader are free to pick the time that works best for your schedule. So whatever works best for you is the day that we would encourage you, that probably should be when you lead that group, right? If it doesn't work for you, we're off to a tough start. So thinking through that is something that we want you to do, but generally speaking, it's a weeknight in the evening. I will say that a caveat that I want to talk about and create some space for is maybe you're interested in potentially doing like a hobby-oriented type of a group. Maybe you're interested in cycling or hiking or an activity type of group as well. That might be a great time for a weekend group. If that's something that you are interested in, we want to be flexible and we want to do what we can to leverage passion and excitement in a way that also can create really intentional spiritual groups and avenues in that way. So if that's something you're interested in, let's certainly talk about that as we meet up at the end of our time and have some dialogue about, hey, what could that look like? How do we structure that in a way that would be effective in still creating disciples? Again, as we've talked about, our groups are not primarily intended to be exclusively social groups. So there are plenty of running groups that exist out there. So if we want to do a running group, we would ask, hey, the fingerprint of that would still be that there would be deep spiritual growth and deep spiritual focus that's present. However, if we wanted to try something like that, let's do it. Let's engage in that. So I think that would be a great time for maybe a weekend group if that's something you're interested in. How often do groups meet? So if the time of the day, it's sometime on a weeknight, how often do they meet? Again, I'm going to speak in some generalities here, but most of our groups meet once a week. I think that's a pretty traditional model. That's not certainly the only model that we're willing to work with, but most of our groups do meet once a week. I think the consistency of rhythm that comes with once a week is a huge reason why we lean that way. Again, we want to incorporate prayer and study and fellowship, and we also want to create community and belonging. And we can incorporate prayer, fellowship, and study, but if we don't do that on a consistent enough basis, it's going to be really difficult to create community and belonging. So generally speaking, once a week is what we've done in terms of how often they meet. But again, I want to reiterate, we're flexible here. If once a week might not work for your schedule, what does? Maybe it's once every 2 weeks that you would meet. I will say that when we get to kind of less than once a month or around that once a month mark, it still obviously is beneficial to meet and to pray and to gather. And the consistency with which we're engaging at that time, I'm not so sure that it's going to allow us to build the community that we're after. And so I think what we would ask is, hey, let's at least meet once a month if we want to really try to sanction something around these sort of group environments. Because if we're not engaging at least once a month, I think we really start to limit the community that actually can be developed. And it makes sense, right? If we have a weekly meeting and most of the group members are also attending one of our Sunday services, you're seeing them twice in a given week. That's more than you see a lot of people, other than maybe your coworkers and your family. Having 2 connection points throughout the course of a week is a lot. And so I think that's where we really start to see that community start to be developed that way. So how often? Generally once a week, but we want to work it with what's available in your schedule. So if that's once every other week, if that's once every 3 weeks, let's talk. But if it's outside of that once a month range, let's still talk and brainstorm about ways that we can maybe handle that. But I think once it gets to that point, we start to lose some of the consistency that's needed to develop relationship. How long do groups meet? Generally, again, somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. 1 hour is pretty short. 1 hour is a short time frame. Let's say you start at 6. Likely there's going to be people trickling in till about 6:05, 6:10. And if you're trying to be done by 7, you should wrap up at like 7:50. So you got like 40 minutes maybe worth of time to really engage. So an hour is really quick, and I would say that 2 hours tends to start to feel pretty long. That can be a space, unless it's really structured and we really have a vision and direction for where we're going. 2 hours is on that longer end. So somewhere in between there, an hour to 2 hours tends to be a good time to meet. Again, if you want to experiment with that, you're free. For an example, our group that my wife and I lead, we meet from 6:30 to 8. That's the time that we meet. But from 6:30 to 6:45, we have 15 minutes where we just want people to come and show up and have some conversations. So 6:30 to 6:45, people show up. We have some snacks available for them to eat, some water, some bubbly, and high chews seem to be pretty popular with our group. So we're giving everybody cavities, which is a lot of fun. But that time is just a time to kind of connect. I think it's also valuable as a time of transition. Sometimes people are coming into these environments right off of work or right off of something else. So providing there maybe 5-10 minutes worth of transition time, I think, can be valuable. So for us, content time, if you will, is really from 6:45 to like 7:50, 7:55. So we have about an hour, although our group meets for an hour and a half. So how long? Somewhere between an hour and 2 hours would be my recommendation, would be what we've seen works best with the groups that we currently have. Outside of the time parameters, how long, I want to speak to maybe the commitment. You know, what am I signing up for? Am I going to lead a group now for the rest of my life? Am I tied to Anchor? No, you're not. Take a deep breath. That's not what we're asking you to do. You can. You certainly can. What we are asking is that you would lead the group through whatever session you're being trained. So we have 2 sessions that take place. We have a fall session and a spring session. This is currently the spring session. So our groups will launch in mid-February, and the spring session will go from mid-February through Memorial Day. So that's about 15 weeks. So you'll lead through the last couple of weeks in February, all of March, all of April, and then a few weeks in May. Likely, and God willing this won't happen, but likely you might get sick one of those weeks, or you're out of town. And so really, I think we're honestly working with probably like 12-ish weeks or so, 12, 13 weeks. If you had that perfect attendance record, it would be about 15. But that's the commitment that we're asking of you, that you would lead through this spring session. I won't lie to you in these moments. My hope and my heart is that all of our groups meet for the long haul. That's not to pressure you into doing that. That's to say, again, if part of the goal here is to develop belonging, consistency over the long period of time, I think is super important in that conversation. And I want to make myself very clear, that still means that all you're committing to is a spring session of leading. We would meet up at the end of that spring session in May. We'd have a conversation. How are things going? How are you feeling? Do we need to adjust something? Do we feel like we can continue to go? But my hope would be that we would meet for years. I think over the course of that time, we would really start to see relationship develop and truly a sense of belonging take place. So people would start to feel rooted and grounded in a way that that you just can't create in 15 weeks. And that's not a knock on the 15-week thing. That's super important that we would do 15 weeks. But my hope would be that maybe we would engage over the long haul. Just for some perspective, a typical year would look like our spring session, mid-February through Memorial Day. And then during the summer, I think we've all lived here long enough to know that Montana summers means no one's here, right? And we understand that, and I think you will only be frustrated if you try to continue to meet throughout the course of summer. So we'd encourage you, hey, what would it look like to maybe have 2 or 3 barbecues? What would it look like to maintain touch points with them? But also, look, you're gonna be gone, they're gonna be gone. That's okay, that's okay. So during the summer would kind of be a reset button, maybe connecting with your group continually throughout summer, but largely this is a time for you to take a deep breath as well. And then if you were to lead in the fall session, we would kick off the week after Labor Day, and we would go through the first week of December. So that's about 13 or 14 weeks there as well. So over the course of a year, that means that you're committing to about 30 weeks out of the 52 to host that group, to be a part of leading and creating and facilitating that environment. December comes, second half of December, holiday season, January, same thing. We pick back up in February, and then the cycle repeats itself. So we've got about 15 weeks in the spring and 13 or 14 weeks or so in the fall. So that's the commitment. If you were to lead, we're asking to lead through the spring session, 15 weeks. How many people are a part of these groups? We cap our groups at anywhere from 10 to 14 people. That's where we kind of put a limit on it. Again, we've found that that's kind of a sweet spot in terms of a number. It's not to say that there isn't value in groups below or above that, but here's a couple reasons why I think that number is great. First, I think when our group gets a little bit too small, for some people it starts to feel really intrusive and uncomfortable. The dynamic changes when we're in a group of 4 or 5, maybe even 6, versus 10, 11, or 12. The dynamic just changes. And so there are some people who, in that smaller setting, man, that's their jam, and that's great. And there are some people as well who really might feel like that space is too intimate or too vulnerable in that place. There's value in it, but I think once we get our groups to a level where they are so small, it starts to actually detract from some of the environments that we're trying to create instead of build it. I will say the caveat to that is, if from the beginning we're telling people that our groups are 5, 6 people, well then we're in a different kind of conversation, right? But I think for what we're after, that 10 to 14 number creates space for everyone to still have a voice and a seat at the table, but also it is not so small that everyone feels like they're kind of under a microscope. I think once we get above that 14 mark, 15, 16, 17, we start to lose the sense of community. I really do. I think that once we kind of pass and surpass that mark, all of a sudden we stop being much of a group and it's more of a gathering. And maybe that's just semantics in some ways. But I think, again, we're trying to create some intimate, vulnerable environments. And that can be really difficult to do when there's 15, 16, 17, 18 people. All of a sudden, people might not feel like they're seen. Their voice doesn't really have the same weight that it does when there's 10 people as opposed to when there's 15. And generally speaking, when we have groups that are 14, we will allow that to take place if there's maybe 2 group leaders who have led groups for a while. They're pretty comfortable with that. Generally, we want to kind of cap it at around 12. So just so you're aware of what that would look like. I want to be clear that at no point during our time are we going to ask you to split or divide your group. I think in so many ways that's counterproductive. If we're trying to create community and belonging, and then we're coming in 6 months and saying, hey, you need to break up, well, that doesn't seem to mesh well, right? There would be times where maybe we'd have some conversations about what would it look like for you to empower some people within your group to help lead. Not only your group, but a potential other group, but we're not going to come in and say, okay, 6 of you go over there and 6 of you go over there because this group now is too big. We want to avoid that sort of language. And I also want to preface and tell you that there's going to be times as we move forward, if you decide to lead some groups, where I am going to ask you, hey, do you have room for one more? Do you have room for one more? That's a mantra that we want to hold true, that we want to always have room for one more. We want to do our best to make sure that everyone has a space to belong and everyone has a space to develop community. And I understand that at a certain point, there might not be room for one more. And I give you full permission to say, look, there's not. But I might ask. I might ask still. I'll do my best to not ask every week. I'll do my best to respect those boundaries. But there are countless times where I've talked to the current group leaders and said, hey, somebody just moved to Missoula. Do you have space for them? Do you have space for them? So it's been my experience throughout leading groups, maybe you're familiar with this as well, that often there's some turnover, especially within the first 2 months. Maybe the first night there's 14 people and 2 months in there's 8 people. So if that's the case, yeah, we might have some space, but maybe in your group you'd have consistent attendance in that way, or maybe you just recognize, hey, if we start to add a few more, the dynamic of our group changes in a big way. So I want to let you know, 10 to 14 kind of is the number that we cap it at. Anything below that can be a little intrusive. Anything above that starts to feel less like a group environment, more like a gathering. I'm going to ask at some point during our time together, hey, you got room for one more? You got room for one more? And you have full permission to say, nope, I don't. Where do our groups meet? Typically, we encourage our groups to meet in homes. And I'd say the primary reason for this, if you'll remember back to the first week, we ended our time with a verse in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. And Paul says to the people of Thessalonica, he says, that I loved you so much that I not only shared with you the gospel of God, but our lives as well. And I don't know if there's a more practical act that we can do than invite someone into our home that is emblematic of sharing our life with them. Our homes are so deeply connected to our life. We have pictures of our family there. Even as simple as our interior decorating, the way we think and see and the environments we try to create in our home, they are fully expressions of who we are. And so to open up a home and host people in that home, I think is such an incredible way to start and set the tone for we're going to live life together. Home is where life happens. Home is where your family is. Home is where you have those intimate conversations. And I think to invite and engage in a group environment in a home helps to facilitate that same sort of sentiment around that group. So that's where typically we meet. If you might not have space in your home, or you're not sure you want to host in your home, or you want to host somewhere else, we can do our best to work with you to find another place. We can talk here. We have a group that meets here on a Tuesday morning at City Life. We can do our best to find another place for you to host. But I would encourage you, hosting in a home is kind of the primary thing, the target, the thing that we're after most. We'll get into this more in a moment. And this is something that I've recently kind of changed my mind on and been chewing on a lot. I will say this, there is immense value in you leading in your own home. And I think there's just as much value in you asking someone else in your group to host. I think as we talk about leadership, we're going to get into this more later on today, but it can feel like you're doing everything. You're creating conversation, you're making sure there's stuff on the table, you're doing all of that, and then you're also needing to clean your home and open up your home, and then maybe you've had a long day and all of a sudden group ends at 8 and people are still hanging out at 9:15, right? Whereas if you're meeting in someone else's home, you can help set the tone and you can help engage in that environment, but also you can help lead in that environment as well, in that group ends at 8:15 rolls around and you can kind of set the tone and say, hey guys, I think it's time to head out. We're gonna allow them to kind of move on with their evening. So I just want to say that I'm not saying you should or should not lead in your own home. I'm leaving that option up to you. I know that some of us may really enjoy leading in our own home. That's what we should do. But if there is some inkling of man, I'm not sure I want to host in our environment, that's okay. And I would encourage you to ask what it would look like for some of your group members to see if they'd want to host in that way. We'll get more into that in depth in just a moment. 2 more things. What do you discuss? What do you go through? Is there content or curriculum that's provided or that's expected in our group environment? Well, each one of our groups moving into the calendar year of 2022 has been free to choose their own content. So if you have a book of the Bible that you really enjoy, great. You're free to go through that. If you have some sort of book that has helped form you as a follower of Jesus, praise God. You can use that. I would ask that if you're wanting to choose your own content, that you run that by me. It's not because I don't trust you or I want to be some sort of like czar that has uncontrolled authority, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're still moving in unity, that we're especially moving in unity of faith. I think that one is in particular something that I want to make sure of. There's a ton of content and there's no like statement of faith for books to be written. You can write a book pretty much saying whatever you want, and just because it's published doesn't mean it's true. And so we want to make sure that what we're writing and what we might be reading and teaching in these environments lines up with what we see in Scripture. I will just say that in like 4.5 years of leading this sort of ministry, I've had to say no once. So it's very unlikely that this is going to happen. But there's also been a time where there weren't this sort of conversation on the front end. There wasn't a conversation on the front end, and it was really difficult and really messy to have to go in and be like, hey, this is like not in line with what we believe, and we need to talk about what it looks like to either change the content that we're talking about, or we need to talk about disbanding this group because this is going against what we believe is a statement of faith. So I'm not expecting that. I don't think that that's going to happen, but that's also why I'd ask, hey, if you're going to choose your own content, would you run it by me? Just so we're on the same page in that. If you are looking for curriculum or content to go through, some of our groups have completed a gospel study of Mark. That's an option for you if that would kind of be something you're interested in. We also are going to launch some sermon studies here moving forward, likely in the month of February, where we're going to take some of the content that's talked about on Sunday and create some conversation around it. So we're going to bring in some supplemental verses, and we're going to bring in some questions we can consider and ask around that. So if that would be something that you're interested in, we're going to do our best to have that up and ready and launched by mid-February. So as these groups launch, that will be something that's available. And I think that's a cool way that we can build continuity as well, not just across our groups, but as kind of people, that we're not just hearing a Sunday sermon and then waiting for another Sunday, but we're hearing a sermon on Sunday, and then on Wednesday or Tuesday or Friday when we come together, we're still chewing on it and thinking about it and discussing it and talking about the practical outcome of it in our life. So that will be an option, and I'm happy to talk more about curriculum or content if that's something that maybe develops some anxiety in you. I would tell you, if there's a book that you want to go through, awesome, great, do it. And if there's a way that you can use some pre-planned content, that's going to make your life a lot easier. I'll just tell you that on the front end. Again, if there is passion around some other content, I want you to be passionate. But I understand that like this is a big commitment, and kind of loading yourself up with, okay, well I got to prep for an hour and a half for group just for content, and then I got to get ready for group, and then that's where we can start to see some burnout happen. So if you're not passionate about some of the content that you might choose, I would encourage you go with some pre-planned stuff that you can kind of go through with your group as opposed to presenting to your group. Last one, we would encourage all of our groups throughout the course of each session to do one outreach per session. One outreach event or engagement per session. I'm not going to tell you what this has to look like. This might look like you partnering with an event that the church is putting on. This might look like you partnering with Habitat for Humanity or the Poverello Center, or any sort of community partnership. We have great relationships with 549 Hope. We have great relationships with River of Life, who do a phenomenal job with outreach. But what we would ask is that every session you dedicate one of your times to engaging in some sort of outreach event. As we talk about becoming and creating holistic disciples of Jesus, being missional has to be a part of that conversation. It has to be. And so we want to encourage us that a rhythm that we get into is that twice a year, if we led for a year, we're doing some sort of outreach program. Maybe your neighbor needs help moving. Maybe someone in your group needs help moving. Whatever that looks like, we want to be the practical hands and feet of Jesus in this. And what's so cool about this is if we get 2 or 3 groups out of this session, that means that for the next 15 weeks, almost every week we'll have some sort of outreach event. I think that's just incredible. That 30 weeks out of the course of the year, there will be some sort of tentative outreach event. that Anchor Church is a part of. That the people of Anchor Church, it's not Anchor Church sponsored, we're not promoting it necessarily on a Sunday, but that the people of our church are engaged in living out the gospel of Christ in our community. I think that's awesome. I think that's so encouraging and incredible. So we want to encourage and ask that 1 week out of our time together that we're doing an outreach program. That might mean on Saturday morning you rally together, whatever that looks like, 1 week of an outreach. Okay? Any questions so far? Again, I told you today's going to be drinking from a fire hose. So bear with me as we kind of move through this. But any questions about some of the content we've gone through thus far? Yeah,
That's
Benji.
that clarification
Yeah.
on the 1 week.
Yeah,
That's not 1 week a month.
correct. 1 week a session.
This session.
Yep. So again, if we're meeting for 15 weeks, that means that 14 of them might be in a home. One of those weeks might be out doing some sort of outreach. And I'll leave it up to you. If you want to meet on, say, again, our group meets on Wednesday, so I'm just going to go with that. If you want to meet on Wednesday and come together on Saturday to do an outreach, that's fine. Or if that week you want your group to kind of not meet that evening, but you're just going to meet on Saturday, that's fine as well. I'll leave that up to you. But one of the 15 weeks would be dedicated. There would be an outreach event or something that week. Yeah. Does that answer that question, Benji?
Yeah.
Cool. I want to talk about some tips and tricks, some things that I think are really easy to implement in a group that really can help build what we're after. It's not going to be this huge new thing. In fact, I think in many ways it's going to be like, oh yeah, hopefully it's really practical and really simple, but I really think it will enhance. So I've given a little bit of a template here of what an example gathering might look like on a timeline. This is a group that would meet from 6 to 7. And maybe after looking at this, you can see why I say that an hour would be really, really quick. It just would be a short amount of time. So if your group meets at 6, at 5:30, you do a little house cleaning. If you're meeting at your own home, you take a couple of minutes and you vacuum and you maybe light a candle and you'd wipe down the counters. I think creating a space where people know that they're expected can do a lot to put them at ease. So if you walk into a place and there's chaos, and I'm not saying there's like people and loud noises and whatever, but there's chaos, the environment is chaos, it can feel like, oh, am I too early? Were you not expecting me? Is this the wrong night of the week? So right away, we're creating an environment where they're gonna step in and they can have some hesitancy and some questions. Whereas, again, I'm not telling you your house has to be immaculate. There's not some sort of like cleaning checklist that we're gonna give. But if you were to walk into a space and it's pretty calm, all of a sudden, it's a different environment you're walking into. So I would encourage you to take a few minutes before group time starts and just do some cleaning up. I'll leave the level up to you. I know that all of us have maybe a little different level of what clean looks like, but tidy up just a little bit before group. At 5:50, be ready to welcome people. All of us kind of come into this space in terms of what we think or how we might approach. If you're invited to a group and it starts at 6, some of us might show up at 6 or 5:55, 5:50. Some of us are showing up at 6:05, right? But I think regardless of what you would do, we want to make sure that we're prepared for what someone else would do. And so I would say that there are people who will show up 10 minutes early. So if your group starts at 6, be prepared 10 minutes early to start welcoming people. Just be ready. Be ready to be at the door, especially during those first gatherings. Someone knocks, yelling at them to come into an environment that they've never been into or a home they've never been at might not be the best idea. Maybe like week 10, yeah, that's fine. They might not even ask anymore. They might just walk in your home. But maybe those first couple of weeks, be prepared to be at the door. Greet people, opening the door, face to face, person to person, as opposed to, yeah, come on in, right? Again, we want to give them the impression that we were expecting them. And I think one easy way that we can do that is be ready at the door. At 6 o'clock, our group would officially start. Maybe we'd open in prayer. We'd have some conversation around maybe what we talked about last time or some of the stuff that we might be going through today. 6:05, asking someone to share their testimony. We're going to get into that in a moment. This isn't a requirement, but I would really encourage all of you to implement it. You'll see that from 6:05 to 6:15, so that means it's 10 minutes of a testimony. 6:15, we're transitioning into the content of the night. We're going to talk about the sermon study, go through whatever study we're working through. At 6:50, ask for prayer requests, pray together, close down. So if this is the model that you would choose to go with, you have 35 minutes to talk about the sermon or to engage in some of the other materials. So an hour is really, really short. And that's assuming that you start at 6 p.m., which I can promise you probably won't happen. So again, I'm not trying to dissuade you from doing an hour. I just want to demonstrate an hour. Really, we're talking about 30, 40 minutes worth of time we're going to spend together, which might be fine. That might be exactly what you're after. So let's talk about maybe a testimony a week really quick. This is, I think, one of the simplest and most practical ways that we can create community. It is so powerful. Whether you do a testimony a week or a couple testimony nights, I just think that knowing each other's story creates such deep bonds right away. And it's I don't want to say it's easy because the testimonies for some can be really difficult, but that's not going to require you to prep anything. That's going to take something else off your plate. That's going to create an opportunity for other people to have a strong voice that night in group, right? I just think that it's all win, 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 win. I think a couple of big reasons why I love this. It is remarkable how often when we ask someone to share their testimony, how blessed they are by reflecting on the story of God in their life. I think if you've maybe lived your life, if you have kids or maybe you have nephews or little cousins, I know I have a little nephew and he's 2.5, and it seems like every time I see him, because I only get to see him like every month, he's grown so much, right? But when you're with it day to day, you don't really see all of that. And I think the testimony is pretty similar in that way. That if we're not intentional to take steps back for a moment and see the growth in our life and see God's hand in our life, it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, this is what it is. This is just the life. But when we just pause for a little bit, we take a step back and we reflect, I think all of a sudden, like, we're seeing God's hand in incredible ways in our life. So that's one reason why I love sharing this testimony. I think it blesses the people who are giving it. And I think it's remarkable how many people don't really know the value of their testimony, let alone maybe even like why it's important. Hey, would you share your testimony? I have been met frequently with like, what do you mean? Oh, would you share how God has moved in your life? Some people don't feel like their testimony is valuable. I found that tends to be people who are either in one of two places. They're either in a place where they've never experienced or had a prodigal son-like season. And man, I'm not believing anyone would do this. That's such a lie. That's such a lie. Testimonies of people who have been faithful to the Lord and never had a season of rebellion, that's the most beautiful one. Wow, it is so incredible to see God's faithfulness at work in their life and their commitment to Him in the way that manifests. So usually people who maybe are in that season feel like their testimony isn't significant, or if someone is currently in a prodigal son type season, they're pretty hesitant to want to share their testimony because they're in a season where they might be actively rebelling against the Lord. And even that gives them such an incredible time to reflect on God's faithfulness in their life. So I can't encourage you more to do this in your group. Again, it's 10 minutes. It creates such great community. It creates an awesome ability for us as leaders to know how we might care for people as they share their own testimony. Maybe they have difficulties in certain environments. Maybe they talk about past struggles, right? All of a sudden, essentially, we're getting a lot of stuff on the table that we didn't know existed that now we're able to step into that environment. Yeah, Amanda.
Would you suggest on the spot asking or letting someone know like a day or so?
That's a great question. So what I found works best is like that first night when you're gathering, as and we'll talk about this in a moment, you're kind of laying some ground rules of what people can expect for a group, and part of that is we're going to share maybe a testimony a week. Does anyone want to go first? So you're giving them a week's time to prep. So then every week you're a week in advance, right? So week 1 you're planning for week 2, week 2 you get week 3, so on and so forth. And I would encourage with that asking people to write it down. I think it does two things. One, it ensures that they're going to come prepared, which is nice. But it also, again, I think is a great exercise to do to reflect on God's faithfulness in their life. We tend to give about 10 minutes. For some people, that's way too much time. For other people, They could talk for 30 minutes, but we want to give enough time to where our story can be told, but not enough time to where like the whole night is just going to be dedicated to that. So 10 minutes has been great. Maybe you want to do 15. I think once we start to get to 5 minutes, I would say that the depth of testimony that can be shared in 5 minutes is pretty limited. I know that 5 minutes might seem like a lot, but it goes by pretty quick when you're trying to tell your own story. So again, experiment with that, but 10 minutes has been a time frame that works well that I've found. Yeah.
Just I know it would take more time, so depending on what this structure is, I find that there's a lot of benefit too after someone shares, even if you open up to everyone else, like, hey, what encouraged you about their story, or how could you speak back? I just think sometimes you just threw out this hopefully vulnerable moment,
right, and not
and
just
be
leaving
like,
it.
thanks for sharing. Let's move on.
Yep.
It can add so much value to say, man, I just want to speak this back into you, or this is what really encouraged me for what I'm going into. Can
That's
really
awesome.
heighten someone's posture of vulnerability.
Totally.
So, like, oh, and that's the power of sharing.
Yeah.
I heard immediately back.
Yeah.
So again, it's time, but
No, that's great. That's great. We're going to talk about some ground rules here in just a moment, but I think talking about like, hey, we're going to be encouragers is a great ground rule, because the last thing we would want going along with that is someone to be vulnerable and share their testimony, and they're met with like, oh, well, have you tried this, or why don't you do this, or how come you're not doing this, or why aren't you incorporating this into your life, right? So I think those type of ground rules where we're saying, hey, we're using language like, what encouragements do you have? I think that's phenomenal to speak into that, like you said, that vulnerable place, and not just kind of be left out hanging to dry of like, why did I share that, right? I think that's really valuable. Again, feel free to use whatever you would like. I just want to make sure that you feel as if you have something in front of you. We have the testimony prompt. We've asked kind of 4 basic areas when we ask someone to give a testimony. 2 of them I would say are really testimony specific. So we ask for family history. Do you have brothers and sisters? Mom and dad, what's that look like? What's your home life look like? Who else in your family is, or has been a significant part of your life? Are you close with your family? So starting to ask some of those questions. For some people, this is going to be the hardest part of their testimony because their family life is really difficult. And we're not asking or forcing them to tell us all the details or anything like that. As we talk about a testimony, I think it's important to provide some clarity along this, or to give people some expectations about what they can talk about. And again, even if it is difficult, that provides so much understanding for us about where that person's coming from. We know that that's kind of a scar or a sore part of their life. So family history is a part of that testimony. Spiritual history. Some questions around that. Where were you raised in a Christian household? How did you come to meet Jesus? Were there any specific people that helped point you to him? What was your life before Jesus? How has it changed since knowing him? And list at least one specific thing that God has done in your life over the last year. Again, not that everyone has to answer all these questions. These are just some kind of helpful ways to get people's minds churning about like what their testimony is and how they might go about telling it. And then those last 2 parts are I would say, a little bit more personal than they are testimonial, if you will. But I think they're valuable nonetheless. Feel free to use them or not. What are you hoping to get out of the group? I think that's such a phenomenal question to ask people. I think sometimes we come into these sorts of spaces because we know that they're good and we believe that they're good, but we don't really know what we're hoping for. We don't know what we're after. And so getting people to think about that as they enter this space of like, what do I hope to see? Or what is an outcome that I hope to accomplish? I'd say for a lot of people, they're just going to be like, I want to get to know people. I want to build some community and relationship. Great, that's awesome. So asking that question, having people think through that. And then lastly, what's one thing you're looking forward to this year? I just think that's a fun question that helps you get to know what's going on in someone's life. Maybe there's a grandbaby on the way, or maybe they're expecting their first child, or maybe they have a cool vacation plan. Again, I think implementing these sorts of things are just some simple ways that we can continue to get to know people on a depth that maybe initial conversation doesn't instantly allow us to get to. So again, feel free to use these types of questions or not. It's certainly not a requirement, but I just want you to have something. If you're like, hey, I want to do testimony, I'm not really sure what that would look like. Hopefully this is a helpful resource to you. Another tip or trick, that I love to do, again, kind of oriented around getting to know people. I love to start groups with a question. We've kind of been embodying that during our time together. Questions like, hey, who is someone you look up to, right? What is it that you admire most about them? Well, you learn a lot about someone's life when they answer that sort of question. And so in doing that, I think it accomplishes, again, another avenue that we can get to know people. But I think one of the other reasons why I love to do that in this sort of testimonial piece is there will be people in your group who are engaged fully, but not verbal processing, right? There will be people who are soaking up every word that's spoken, but they're just not going to share. Well, incorporating testimonies and incorporating this question to start the group makes sure that they have a voice as well. It gives them an opportunity to speak in a way that hopefully won't be intrusive or feel like they are pressured to share, but it also incorporates their voice into the group and makes sure that they know that they have time and space to share what their voice might bring to the table, okay? So that's a couple of reasons why I appreciate those. This one's pretty simple, but I think it is worth talking about. Start and end on time. Start and end on time. This is a big commitment for someone to give 2 hours, an hour and a half, an hour of their week to engage further in community. And I think one of the simplest ways we can honor that is by starting when we say we'll start and ending when we say we'll end. Because the moment we don't do that, and again, I'm not talking to the second, but I'm saying if we say we're going to start at 6, let's not start at 6:30, because instantly we're breaking trust. Right away, we're breaking trust with people. And again, there's going to be some people where being on time is more important to others. That's okay. This isn't to say that you need to force everyone to see the same thing the same way, but it is to say that there will be people in the group who, when the group is not starting or ending on time, they're starting to get frustrated or anxious or feel disrespected. So we want to just do our best to start and end on time. Again, if you're going to start at 6, that's the time that you say, know that you're probably going to start at like 6:10. People are going to show up. Sometimes, especially in the winter, I mean, obviously we're all aware, sometimes it takes another 15 minutes to get somewhere. Sometimes, especially in the beginning, people don't know where the house is. So I'd encourage you to maybe build some buffer time in there. And this next piece is determining the ground rules, the last kind of tips and trick. I think that's a great time to talk about this. So during your first meeting, I would encourage you to move into that space and maybe not dive into content that night as much as maybe have dinner or have some sort of fellowship opportunity to connect with one another and just talk about what to expect from the group. Talk about what they've signed up for. Let them know, hey, you've signed up for 15 weeks. We're going to be meeting together through this spring session. That alleviates the burden off of your shoulders to feel like you've got to be there for the rest of history for them, and they know what they've signed up for. All of a sudden, it's kind of this, I can commit to 15 weeks as opposed to this ambiguous, how long are we doing this type of a thing. I think when we're starting is a really important topic to discuss during that time. Letting people know, like, hey, we want to start at 6 o'clock. And when I say that, I mean, we want to start talking about content at 6 o'clock. We want to really be intentional with group time. So maybe show up at 5:45 if you're looking to have some conversation or connect, because we really want to do our best to start at 6. It's a lot easier to set that tone at the beginning than it is to try to get that to happen 3, 4, 5 meetings in. Because all of a sudden patterns are starting to form and people are leaving the house at the same time, week 5, and that's not the time we're hoping for. So giving someone an expectation the first week can be helpful. Some other ground rules that I think can be really helpful are confidentiality. What's shared here stays here. There is caveats to that if we're talking about illegal activity, if we're talking about abuse. Obviously that needs to move past just a conversation there of like, okay, well, we're not going to talk about that or tell anyone. But generally speaking, what is shared there should stay there. Setting ground rules, Kyle, to your point of like encouraging, I love to use language like, hey, we're not here to fix anybody. It's not our job. Keep advice to a very minimal amount. There's nothing that kills vulnerability quite like being told exactly what to do and why what you're doing has not worked. So again, Jen shared a lot about that last week, right? Often in those serious moments of testimonial or vulnerability, less is more. Less can be a lot more in those spaces. So last thing someone wants to, well, I shouldn't say that. Often people don't want to be met with being told what to do. They just want to be heard. They just want to know that they have a space to exist in that way. So we're not here to fix anybody. When people are talking, we're listening, right? Setting just, again, simple things. And Benji, you mentioned this at the start. I know that for some of us, this might feel like, well, of course we're going to do those things, but some people don't know group dynamics. They just don't know how to exist in them. Maybe they've never been in them, or maybe they've been in them a lot and they've never had anyone kind of help them understand that this is not just a space where you can share all your insight, but it's a space where we're trying to gather together. So these sorts of setting ground rules, I think, is a great tool that you can set yourself up for success with as you move into this space. And I would say as well, return to these often. Return to them often. Create language in your group where maybe at the beginning of every testimony, you're introducing this person and you're just reminding your group, remember, we're not here to fix anybody. We're just grateful that they'd share. Continuing to implement that sort of language regularly within your group, I think, helps instill what it is that we're talking about. Instead of you talk about it week 1 and then week 14, no one said anything about what time they're supposed to show up since, right? So making this something that's kind of on your tongue and on your group's mind a lot, right? So those are just some helpful tips and tricks. Again, not that you have to use all of them, but in my experience, I've found that kind of engaging in some of these types of things can really be some simple, easy, practical ways to enhance group environment as well as kind of set yourself up for success. Any questions thus far? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Come back together, we'll close down talking about leadership teams, life cycles of teams, and some other fun stuff. Like I said, I want to turn our attention to talking about models of ownership or leadership teams, because I think it's so important to talk about this as we talk about leading groups. This is not a conversation about your capability, if you are competent enough. I fully believe that of each one of you. This is a conversation of longevity and sustainability. And I think let me start by saying I understand that there is a vast difference between leading a nation and leading a group. So I want to be careful with how we're treating the similarities here. And I think that there's some wisdom in what Jethro is speaking that can really benefit us when it comes to leadership, certainly within the context of our group, but leadership in general when we think about this. So as we look at this passage, I think we have kind of two different things happening. We have Jethro speaking about the problem and Jethro putting forth a solution. So I think we see the problem listed in verses 14, 17, and 18. It says, when his father-in-law, Jethro, saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, "What is this you are doing for the people? Why do you do it alone and sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" In 17, Jethro replied to Moses and said, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The workload is too heavy for you, and you cannot handle it alone." I think it's important to note here that as Jethro starts to maybe give some solutions to this, clearly what he is saying is not good, is not that Moses wants to care for the people. It's not that Moses wants to mediate disputes. It's not that Moses is stepping into a place of need. That's not what Jethro would speak and say, that's not good. What he would say in terms of what is damaging about how Moses is choosing to lead in this moment is that he's doing it by himself. In particular, that the workload that he is carrying is too much. And notice that it's not just out of a concern for Moses, but for the people as well. He says this in 17, "What you are doing is not good." 18, "You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The workload is too heavy for you and you cannot handle it alone." Again, Big difference between mediating the disputes of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, and facilitating a group environment of 10 to 14 people, right? Huge difference. And let's be honest, it's not as if you leading a group is the only thing that you have on your plate during a week. That's not the only thing that we're committed to. We have jobs, we have families, we have other engagements that we're committing to. And so I want to take a step back from viewing this strictly through the lens of exclusive group-oriented conversation and viewing it through the lens of we are all committed to a lot in the course of our life. And this is not intended to be just one more thing that we put on to our plate. So he lays out the problem. What you're doing is not good because you're doing it by yourself. So the solution in 19 through 23, he says, listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God. Bring their disputes to him. So he's encouraging him to continue in leadership, right? The heart of what you're trying to do, you must continue to do. Teach them his decrees and instructions and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all people, men who fear God, trustworthy, who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you, the simple cases they can decide themselves. They will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. So the solution here is not, hey, Moses, stop trying to do what you're doing, but it's, hey, Moses, how do we get more people to come alongside you in accomplishing the mission that's before you? And I think that's so important when we talk about group conversations and ownership within our group, buy-in within our group, and this notion of leadership teams. I fully believe that each one of you are capable of leading in this environment. And like I said, my hope is that we're doing this for at least 30 weeks over the course of a year. And there are few things that will make us want to do this less than when our workload is more than we can carry. So what would it look like for us to follow Jethro's advice? It's not just, hey, figure out anybody. It's, hey, pick capable people. Pick capable people. And we want to talk about that in a moment. But what he says is pick them to oversee the thousands and the hundreds and the fifties and the tens. So essentially he's saying delegate some of the responsibility. In particular, delegate some of the responsibility that doesn't demand the most attention. So what would that look like for us? How can we begin to delegate and give some things away over the course of our group? Well, I think one of the things that we can do is develop new leaders in the course of our group. Again, I want to remind us of some of our conversation in our first time where we defined words like church, discipleship, and disciple. This is one of the ways in which the process of discipleship can really start to come to life. Over the course of your group, our hope would be that as we're talking about the things of the Lord and praying and seeking him and having dialogue, we're naturally beginning to have conversation and discipleship there. And this can be a way in which we're intentionally discipling one or two people in the context of our group as well. And that doesn't mean you meet up with them more, right? That isn't more commitment, but it is someone who can help you carry the load. Someone who can help you facilitate things that you can give over in responsibility, and some qualifications for what to look for. They love Jesus, they love his church, and they have a heart for the lost. That these people would treat others well. That these people are the ones who maybe are going up to people in the group and having conversation with them even though they don't know them. They're initiating conversation. That they hold scripture in a high view and view it as authoritative. That they're eager to help. That they're humble. That they're not a new believer, that they're regularly attending group and Sunday services. Again, I don't think we're looking for like any sort of super Christian year. I don't think we're looking for, oh man, you might find one over the course of 10 years of leading group. I think what we're saying here is like, are there people who are engaged in what you're doing? And how do you approach them and have conversations with them to say, hey, can you help me? I need some help. Not because you're incompetent, not because you're not capable, but because we want to do this over the long haul. And additionally, I think not just from your perspective of making sure you don't get burned out, but as we start to delegate things and other people start to have more ownership, it becomes more valuable to them. There's more buy-in, there's more participation when they have kind of skin in the game instead of just showing up. So what are some possible things for you to give away? Hosting. Is there someone in your group who you could ask to host? That might mean that you need to meet at your home for a week or two, but is there someone over the course of that time that you can ask to host? Is there someone who you can say, hey, we're going to do a testimony a week, and it would mean a lot if you could coordinate that? Every week you're going to follow up with whoever's given their testimony and just make sure that they're prepared. Right? There's one less responsibility that you're kind of taking on and taking up. Prayer and follow-up texts. Hey, when we move into a time of prayer, I'm really going to transition and hand this off to you. Would you be willing over the course of the week to send out these prayer requests to our group in a text? Would you be willing to follow up with people as they share what they're praying about or what they're asking? Someone has a loved one who needs prayer. Maybe you meet on Wednesday and on Friday they send out texts. And they say, hey, we just want to follow up. How's so-and-so doing? Right? Snacks. Hey, would you bring a case of bubbly or a pack of water? Or would you make something, or could you grab some chips and salsa on your way over? Something, I know that these things are simple, but I think the more that we start to delegate some of this responsibility, the easier this load is for us to carry. And I want to remind us of some of Jethro's advice here about the problem and the solution. In the problem, he says, you and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. It's not just you, but it's them. They're aware of the state you're coming into this with. The solution, if you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain and these people will go home satisfied. Pete Scazzaro, guy who is the leader of the Emotionally Healthy series, maybe you've heard of that, spirituality, church. He has a phrase in the Emotionally Healthy Church where he says, as the leader goes, so goes the church. And I think the same can be said for these groups. As the leader goes, so goes the group. If we're coming into that and we're like anxious and we're kind of like burned out, people are going to be able to pick up on that. And there might be times and days over the course of us leading where that's just natural. Had a rough day. That's okay. This sort of conversation is not like, hey, you can never have a bad day. Much more, hey, how can we be proactive so that those sorts of bad days or hardships aren't because of the burden of some of what you're doing in the context of leading this group? So that you're not, it's 5:15 and your group meets at 6 and you're not like, oh man, I forgot to text them. Someone else is doing that. Someone else is taking that off your plate. You're creating buy-in amongst your team, you're creating buy-in amongst your group, and you're facilitating this environment together with other people as opposed to doing it by yourself. Because again, like I said, I think there are a few things that will make us want to not be a part of this environment for a long time other than being burned out. I really believe that. That's probably going to be one of the number one reasons why people don't want to continue to lead is like, this is just too much. And that still might be the case, even if we're being proactive and asking for ownership, and that's okay. That's okay. I just would hate for us to be like, oh, well, this is too much, because we're just doing it all by ourselves and we haven't asked anybody for help. So I think, again, big difference between old Jethro and Moses and leading the entire people of Israel in our group, but I think that there's still some wisdom there that we can glean from. So you'll see in that handout, there's some of those qualifications listed for those people and kind of a guide, right? Invite them to consider leadership. Give them some specifics of what that could look like. Not just, hey, will you text people? Like, let them know when they should text people and let them know what you're hoping that text might look like. Let them know how them saying yes to helping in this group environment will, what difference from what you're doing now to what we're asking you to do, what is the difference? And then lastly, if they're agreeing to those sorts of things, let your group know. Say, hey, I'm no longer going to be communicating, I'm passing that off. Benji's going to be sending out a text every Wednesday letting us know when group is, so that they're kind of aware and familiar with that process. I want to talk about a couple more things. What does facilitating look like? You'll see that on that next page with all those fun circle graphs. Had a lot of fun making those this week. I want to keep this relatively brief, but as we talk about facilitating, that's going to be our primary job in the course of the content-oriented piece of our group. We spent a lot of time last week talking about how to handle more emotionally sensitive times. And this conversation about facilitating is going to be more content-oriented times. So we have 3 different models here. We have leader-centered facilitating. That's where kind of the leader there is at the bottom of that circle and all the arrows are pointing out. So a leader-centered facilitating would look an awful lot like what we've been doing over the last 3 weeks in this environment. There's a lot of information being disseminated. It's more of a teaching environment. Might look like our Sunday service, right? And there will be times over the course of your group where this sort of conversation might be necessary. You might need to explain some things, especially as your group gets going. Your voice needs to probably help lead the charge a lot, and that's okay. But this is not the model that we want our groups to look like over the course of the 15 weeks. This is not just a time for us to share what we know with the people who are a part of our group. There will be times where there are questions asked of you, where we need to answer them, right? There will be times where we need to give direction, where this sort of leader-centered facilitating will need to take place. But this is not the ideal as to what we're looking for over the long term. If we move over to the right, we have group response facilitating, and all of those arrows are pointing inward. So this is what happens when essentially maybe the leader asks a question and like one by one someone might answer. And it's only and exclusively in response to leaders' questions or promptings or guidings. Again, there is some value here, and there will be times where your group likely will look like this. I would say if you're going to go through some more structured curriculum, this is going to be the feel of it at the beginning. As people start to understand what the dynamic is at play, it might feel a little robotic at times. And this in and of itself is not entirely bad or wrong. However, we don't want this to be the primary dynamic of our facilitating as well. We don't want it to be leader-centered. And both in me as a leader disseminating information and also me as the leader being the one to whom all things are communicated to, both of those are leader-centric. What we're after is that group conversation, that third one in the middle there. And you can see that the arrows are just bouncing around, right? They're just kind of going everywhere. People are feeding off of the conversation happening. There is freedom to respond to what someone else might have shared. Again, not giving advice or not condemning someone, but having dialogue and having conversation surrounding the topic at hand. And as a facilitator, your job is to pick the conversation up as it begins to slow down and maybe lob another softball out there. Get that conversation back going. We want our group to be conversing with one another. It's going to take some time to get there. I think for our group, I'd say we just started to get there. And this is, for some of them, we're a little over a year in. That's not to say that that's the norm. I'm just saying it's going to take some time for people. But I think when we talk about ground rules, determining some of those up front, hey, we want to participate in conversation. We want this to be a we-centered activity, not a me-centered activity. I'm going to do my best to help facilitate, but we really desire for everyone to start to have conversation with each other. I think even a simple guideline like that can really help people understand what we're after. You'll see some facilitating tips at the bottom there. I think these are just some best practice ways that we can go about creating that sort of environment. Again, there's a reason why all of these are in a circle. I think a circle is most conducive for these sorts of conversations. Again, you'll see some other tips and hints there. Develop we mentality. Try to include everyone. Ask other people what they might think. So feel free to look through that as we continue on. And I want to get to this life cycle of a team. Last page in your handout. I had a lot of fun making graphs this week. Probably spent more time on that than was necessary. But we're going to start obviously in that one, this life cycle of a team, life cycle of a group. So that stage one is what we would call, I think, orientation. Stage one is what we would call orientation. And so in this orientation phase, we're beginning to learn what's expected of us in this group environment. We're learning the ground rules. We're learning people's names. We're learning when it starts, how long it goes, right? There's this orientation process that happens to get us kind of familiar with what's taking place. That's the start of every new group, the start of every new season, the start of every new relationship. That's kind of where we start as we are getting our bearings about what's expected of us. We kind of move down into 2, and often, not always, but often, there is this infatuation period where we're kind of really excited about what we've learned. We're moving into this space with some expectations. We're pumped. That moves into stage 3 of kind of the honeymoon phase. Maybe you're familiar with this sorts of language relationally, right? In the honeymoon phase, your excitement tends to blur your vision a little bit as to what's really going on there. Because you're pumped about what this could be, what it does represent. And maybe you're not quite seeing some of what is going on and what is present. Which then moves us into 4, which is disorientation. Now, to get to this point, depending on the person or the environment, this could take 3 months. This could take 15 minutes. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're handling the orientation portion well, because I think that gives us an opportunity to really help set guidelines and expectations so that as we get to this disorientation piece, we have done the best job that we can to align expectations with reality. So if we had like a graph here that looked kind of like this, right? And this was expectation and this was reality. The difference in this is how great or small the disappointment is going to be. If we had these grand expectations and what's really going to happen is nowhere close to that, we're going to be really disappointed. But if we can really help set expectations as close as we can to what reality looks like, there still might be some disappointment, but it's going to be a lot more minimal. And so we want to handle that orientation piece well so that when we get to disorientation, we don't have this massive, well, what are we doing here? Often in this disorientation piece, there's doubt, there's questioning of like, wait a second, this isn't what I thought it would be. I'm not seeing what I thought I would see. I'm not growing the way I thought I would grow. And often what happens is this 4A, this dotted line, we jump. We go back to orientation. We find something new. We try another group. We want to get into a new space. And if we're not careful, we personally, but also the environments of our group can just start to breed this cycle of orientation to disorientation. And every 3, 4, 5 weeks, we just see people coming and going. So we want to encourage you as the leader to be aware that you likely will go through a time of disorientation. You might be week 5, week 6, and you're like, God, this is not going the way that I thought it was. What is happening? Why aren't people talking? Why aren't we connecting? People aren't showing up. And we want to have this kind of tendency to jump. Let's start over. Let's do something different here. This isn't working. We're going to completely scrap it. But if we go from 4 to 5, we start to get to this point of what we would call reflection. And during this reflection period, we start to sit with the fact that there is a discrepancy between what we were expecting and what's happening. But we would also sit with the fact that that doesn't mean that it's bad. Yeah. That there still is good that can take place there. There still is growth that is happening there. Man, this isn't how I hoped it would be. This isn't what I thought it might look like, but it's still something that's beneficial. It's still something that's worth doing. And then reflection leads to reorientation. We begin to reorient our expectations around what is actually happening as opposed to what we wanted or thought or expected. Then all of a sudden, if we engage in this process, we're kind of moving fluidly through it again and again and again and again. But I want to share this with you because, one, I think you as a leader will likely come to a point over the course of 15 weeks where you're disoriented. And you're going, this is not what I thought it would be. This isn't what I had hoped for. And maybe it's not over the course of 15 weeks. Maybe you lead over the course of a year, and it's actually week 22. And in week 22, you're going, well, wait a second. This isn't what we did in week 7. This isn't nearly as good as what happened before. There will be a time as you lead where you're going to be disoriented and you're going to maybe be tempted to want to jump. And I would just encourage you that if we do that, we begin to short circuit this process. I also want to let you know this kind of life cycle of a team, because I think it's common that group members experience this too. It's common that other people will be going through this same sort of process. And so on that random Tuesday in March, when it's cloudy and gray and people are just kind of like walking around with a little bit of a gorilla on their shoulder, like, oh, you know, we just want like sunshine and spring. We've been doing the same thing now for a few weeks. Remember to just encourage them. Like, hey, this is good. I know that maybe it's not as exciting as it used to be. I know that maybe we're getting more into a rhythm, but I just want to encourage you and remind you that this is good work that we're doing here. Help them to move past that point of disorientation themselves. Help yourself as a leader to be reminded to move past that sort of disorientation place as well. And continue on to that reflection, that reorientation, and not give into that pull and desire in us to maybe just want to say, okay, well, let's start over. Let's kind of start from scratch. I want to talk about handling difficult situations. Skylar, you had brought this up at the beginning. We're going to maybe do some small amounts of role playing with this before we close down. I thought your example was one that certainly I had listed. Skylar, someone who kind of dominates conversation. Benji, I thought your input was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Again, just reiterating, praise in public, correct in private. It's just a great rule of thumb. We don't want to come off someone is engaging in something that might not be helpful, and in the middle of our group we're like, hey, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing that. Buzzkill. Whole kind of the room just goes cold instantly. Correct in private. There may be times, exceptional times, where correction in public may be necessary. If there are some like obscene, and I don't mean necessarily obscene as like someone curses, I mean like really demonstrative wrong things to say to someone, yeah, we might have to step into that. Be like, hey, that's not appropriate in this environment. That might happen. I hope it doesn't, but it might. But generally speaking, to the best of our ability, we want to praise in public and correct in private. I'd say as well, when it comes to dealing with some conflict, I've benefited from this, and maybe you will as well. I would wait until you've seen a pattern of 3. Sometimes people are late because they hit every red light, or work happened, or they had a flat tire. So if every single time there's something that's going on, we're like, well, we got to address it. I'd guess most of the time it's not an issue. It's just a circumstance maybe out of someone's control, or someone's like pretty down or in the dumps at group. Certainly check up on that, but if that's not their norm, it's probably they had a bad day. It's probably something minor's going on. So this kind of repeated theme of 3, I think, starts to give us an understanding that like, no, this is actually a behavior, much less something just that happens in life. If someone's late 3 times in a row, I would guess that there's grounds there to be like, that's probably because they're going to be late pretty consistently, much more than like, they were late this week, or work ran late, they had a flat tire, and they hit every red light. That might happen too, but I think once we start to see this thing and this pattern develop, there's actually grounds to be like, okay, this is something that we should address. So that gives you some, I don't have to be like viewing everything through this microscope of like, oh, you were late one time, what are you doing? Like, oh no, if they're consistently late. Or if someone shares a lot one group, that doesn't mean they're going to dominate every group. But if they do it 3 groups in a row, okay, we have enough there to say this probably needs to be addressed. Okay. When it comes to conflict, especially in group dynamics, our groups are going to look to us to handle it. And I think in some ways that can be really challenging because maybe some of us don't really want to handle conflict that much. But our group is expecting you to do that. If there is someone who is oversharing or who is carrying a tone that is kind of belittling, people will look to you to deal with it. And we want to honor them by engaging with that person in a way that helps the group environment. So in many ways, as difficult as conflict might be, as group leaders, we're signing up to say we're going to be the ones to handle confrontation and conflict that's present. Yeah, Nick?
So if you're part of the group, how are you not overstepping boundaries by bringing that to the attention of your leader? Like the example that Skylar brought up, like is happening in our group,
Sure.
You're not leading it. So
Yep.
how are we like careful when it comes to not overstepping our boundaries as like we're not the leaders?
Yeah.
Bringing that to their attention.
Yeah. Yeah. In particular, the leader's attention, or in particular, the person.
The leader's attention. in
Yeah.
that.
I would say you should have a conversation with the leader. I would say where you might start to overstep boundaries, at least initially, is if you were to just approach that individual yourself. Within the context of that group, depending on kind of who it is and what's at play there, likely the group is understanding that there is someone who's kind of helping to lead this environment. And so allowing them to handle that situation, I think, would be the route we'd want to go. I don't think it would be overstepping your bounds at all to go to the leader and be like, hey, I'm noticing that this is happening. It might just be my perspective. Do you feel the same way? And then allow there to be some conversation surrounding that. My guess is they're like, yeah, I see that too, you know. Oh. Someone's trying to lock the building.
It's gonna be 10 in the morning.
Do you want me to go run over there?
Oh, don't do this to me. Kyle, would you mind going out there to the keypad?
Yeah.
Do you know the combo?
I think it's saved in here somewhere.
Yeah. 5114 and pound and just hit stay. I would guess the pickleballers are locking up.
Okay.
Hopefully we don't get the first time I ever held training in here, I didn't know some key codes only unlock half the building. And so I didn't know that, and I opened this up and the siren just blitzed. So loud. Oh, it was a nightmare. Anyway, handling conflict. Again, praise private, correct in public. Someone who dominates conversation, I feel like we addressed that. Someone who's not showing up or responding, this is one that likely you're going to encounter. People are going to sign up for the group, and they're not going to come. You're going to send out an initial text or a phone call, and they're not going to show up. I would encourage you to reach out 3 times. Reach out to them via email or text. I would say at least one of those 3 times should be a phone call. Try to connect with them that way. And after 3 times, be gracious, be loving, let them know that they're welcomed, but don't feel like every week for 15 weeks you've got to continue to bark up a tree like that. So reach out to them. If they are present, maybe at church, you're aware of who they are, approaching them, having a conversation. Hey, just want to check in. Is this something you're still wanting to do? Right? But I want to release you from the burden of like, oh man, I tried to connect with them a few times and they're not showing up. That's okay. Some people get really kind of into that moment of like, I'm going to do this. And then they're like, I don't think I'm ready to do this. That's okay. That's okay. In some ways that's going to be expected. People will likely engage in that, but just know 3 times would be the way to do that. Skylar, do you have a question?
No, sorry.
No, that's fine. This one I think can be kind of awkward if we don't handle it well. Someone who confesses or repents or says a praise of God in the way in which they have been kind of sustained. And in particular, I think that this can be around sexual sin. That is when I would say that this tends to maybe get a little bit uncomfortable. Statistics are what they are, and it tells us that younger men, 18 to about 30, about 77%, give or take, are engaging in pornography use about once a month, if not more. Older than that, 30 to about 50, it's about 62% once a month. So there's still a lot of this happening. And the statistics are increasingly going up for women. It's not just a men's issue anymore in the way that it might have been, or at least perceived to be. And so there have been times, in fact, there was some moments that we've encountered even within our group where we're just kind of creating space and there's a conversation that ends up happening about pornography. I would encourage you that if someone, you're in a time like this and you're just asking for maybe sharing what the Lord's done in their life and they're like, it's been 2 weeks since I viewed porn, that's an opportunity to praise in public. I know that it's uncomfortable. I know that might feel like, oh boy, this is a taboo subject. But how we handle that is so critically important because it sets the tone as to whether or not engaging in conversation about what's really happening underneath the surface is welcomed or if we should just pretend like it doesn't exist. Praising in public. Now, if it's starting to be explicit conversation, yeah, we need to have a conversation with that of like, hey, let's maybe you and I can talk about some of the things that you're sharing here, but we just want to encourage you and praise God for the work he's done in your life. So I'm not saying that this is some sort of free-for-all and people can say whatever they want, but I will say that in particular with pornography, statistics are what they are, and this one is far more prevalent, and I think because of its sexual nature, it can carry with it a degree of discomfort if we're not prepared for it. I would just tell you that you should move into that space expecting that at some point in time there's going to be a conversation surrounding that. Whether or not that's public in your group or someone approaching you about it, maybe not. But the last thing I think we want to do is be caught off guard by someone saying, oh, hey, this is something I'm dealing with in my life. So that would be an encouragement that I would give to you. I know that might be uncomfortable. It might be more uncomfortable for some of us than others, but I would encourage you, man, we got to praise that. God's doing some great work in their life. They're sharing that really vulnerably. And the last thing we'd want to do is be like, hey, that's kind of taboo to talk about here. Maybe it's some other space or some other group. I just think that sends the wrong message in terms of what we're trying to create within the context of our group. I want to close down as we have a few minutes left. Again, I understand that today, maybe more so than other days, was a lot of content. Hopefully it was practical. Hopefully it was helpful. But I want to just remind us as to why we're doing this. We're not doing this to just have people in our homes. We're not doing this just to have groups where we have a bunch of friends. We're doing this to create disciples of Jesus. And that's why we're willing to have hard conversations and handle conflict. That's why we're willing to engage in difficult conversations or awkward conversations, is because we desperately want to engage in the process of discipleship and create disciples of Christ. That's why we have groups. That's why we do what we do. That's why we're saying, hey, will you give up 15 weeks of your year in creating these spaces? Because we want to create disciples of Jesus. We want to see our church, our community, our people be empowered and equipped to go do the works of ministry before them in their day-to-day life. And we want to do that in a more holistic manner in the process. We want to engage our people in becoming the church and not just attending the church, but that they want to have an active hand in what it means to be the people of God and to do the practical work of ministry within their own life and the lives of other people. And so that's why we're doing this. That is why we're doing this. We aim everything at creating holistic disciples of Jesus. And we're going to study together, and we're going to pray together, and we're going to have fellowship together in hopes that God would show up and move, in hopes that he would help continue to transform us in our own life, in the lives of the people of our groups, so that we have disciple makers in our church. And we're continually creating disciples within our church. As I thought about that, I don't know if you're familiar with some commissioning stuff or not, and maybe this isn't even that formal of a commissioning, but as I was just kind of praying through that, I just felt led to the book of 2 Timothy. If you're familiar with that book, I feel like so much of Paul's language is about continuing to move forward for Timothy. Continue to do the good, faithful work of ministry. Don't fall into the traps around you. This is why we're doing what we're doing and going where we're going and headed where we're headed. And so what I did is I just read through the whole book and I just tried to write down some practical words from Paul that he instructed Timothy that I thought, man, we need to hear that again today. And so I've just kind of written down some statements that Paul gives us. And if you'd feel comfortable, I would encourage you, would you be willing to maybe just close your eyes and open your hands? I want to read this over us as potential leaders, as people who are going to engage in the practical work of ministry. I thank God for you and your genuine faith. Remember, God saved and called us to live a holy life. He did this not because we deserve it, but because that was his plan from the beginning of time, to show us his grace through Christ Jesus. And now, he has made all this plain to us by the appearing of Christ Jesus, our Savior. He broke the power of death and illuminated the way of life and immortality through the good news. Hold on to this through the power of the Holy Spirit who lives within us, and carefully guard the precious truth that has been entrusted to you. Be strong through the grace God gives you in Christ Jesus. You have heard the goodness of the gospel. Now teach these truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others. Work hard so you can present yourself to God and receive his approval. Be a good worker, one who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly explains the word of truth. For a time is coming where people will love only themselves and their money. They will be boastful and proud, scoffing at God, disobedient to their parents and ungrateful. They will consider nothing sacred. They will be unloving and unforgiving. They will slander others and have no self-control. They will be cruel and hate what is good. They will betray their friends, be reckless, be puffed up with pride, and love pleasure rather than God. They will act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. Stay away. You must remain faithful to the things you have been taught.
Yeah.
You know what is true, for you can trust those who taught you. You have been taught the Holy Scriptures, and they have given you the wisdom to receive the salvation that comes by trusting in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what is wrong in our lives. It corrects us when we were wrong and teaches us to do what is right. God uses it to prepare and equip his people to do every work. Continue to preach the word, for a time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They will follow their own desires. They will look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. They will reject truth and chase after myths. But you should keep a clear mind in every situation. And don't be afraid for suffering for the Lord. Work at telling others the good news.
Yeah.
And fully carry out the ministry God has given you.
Yes.
Lord, we pray that that would be true of us as we move out from this space. God, we pray that we would be faithful messengers of your gospel. God, we pray that we would guard and protect the good news that has been entrusted to us. God, that we can believe and trust in it because it comes from your holy scriptures. It comes from the words of the prophets and the apostles before us. It is carrying the weight and inspiration of your Spirit, and it is still practical and useful for today. God, help us to be faithful in living lives that honor you and entering other people's lives and pointing them to you. God, and help us to have a passion and a call and a burden on our heart to do the ministry and work in front of us. God, that by your power, you can sustain us. God, by your grace, you can help us. Lord, and by your boldness, you can help proclaim the gospel, proclaim the truth and the beauty of Jesus Christ into the lives of those that we might encounter. Lord, we are blessed by you. We are blessed that you would consider us a part of your eternal plan to help spread your good news in this kingdom, in this earth. God, may we never forget the privilege that it is to be your co-laborer in the gospel, that you would choose to use us, that you would choose to love us, that you would give us a voice and an opportunity to help build your kingdom here on this earth. God, we ask for your blessing. We ask for your anointing. And we ask that this would bring you glory and honor. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.